Exiled at 15 for wasting wood, she built a shed over her house. Amos Keller, who had survived 12 Montana winters, warned her, "That boy will be dead by February. You're building a coffin." She had $9, an 8-year-old brother, and needed 8 cords of firewood she had no way to cut. On January 9th, 1887, 16 inches of snow fell in 16 hours. But 5 months earlier, Marta Stahl had never felled a tree or survived a single winter without a colony around her. The freight platform at Lewistown, Montana Territory was nothing more than bare planks laid over mud. Marta stepped down from the rail car and pulled her brother after her. Jakob was 8 years old. He weighed perhaps 50 pounds. He held her hand so tight his knuckles went white. Everything they owned fit in a canvas sack slung over Marta's shoulder, a hand axe, a change of clothes for each of them, $11 in coin wrapped in a scrap of calico, and a letter R creased, refolded so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth, describing 160 acres of land she had never seen. She was 15 years old. The year was 1886, and the Northern Pacific freight clerk was staring at her like she had crawled out of the ground. "You the German girl?" he asked. Marta nodded. Her English was good enough, but her accent marked her. The flat vowels, the hard consonants, the rhythm of a language learned second, not first. "Your people coming to fetch you?" "No." The clerk looked at Jakob, looked at the canvas sack, looked at the empty platform stretching in both directions. Not another soul in sight. "You got a husband coming? Father? Uncle?" "No." He shook his head and walked away. Marta heard him mutter something to a man loading crates onto a wagon. She caught only one word: Hutterite. The man with the crates glanced over his shoulder at her, then looked away. She was used to that, the looking away. The Bonhomme colony in South Dakota had looked away from her too. For 3 months after her mother died, Marta had eaten alone, worked alone, slept in a storage shed because no family would take her in. The elders had made their position clear. She had wasted communal resources on foolish building experiments. She had questioned the old ways. She had refused to submit, and so they gave her $11, her father's old letter describing unclaimed Montana land and directions to the railroad. "Go," Elder Wirtz had said. "Perhaps the English God will teach you what the brooder could not." Now she stood on a platform in Montana Territory with an 8-year-old brother who hadn't spoken more than 10 words since their mother's funeral. 12 miles of unfamiliar country lay between her and her claim. She had no horse, no wagon, no map beyond the letter's description. East of Lewistown, follow the creek, good timber on the north slope. She had 14 weeks until winter. Marta hoisted the canvas sack higher on her shoulder and tugged Jakob toward the road. "Walk," she said. "We have far to go." The claim was exactly as her father's letter described, and nothing like she had imagined. Good timber on the north slope, yes, a creek running clear and cold through the eastern edge, yes. Southern exposure for building. On a meadow for a garden, wild grass tall enough to hide a child. But the land was enormous, vast, empty in a way that made her chest hurt. The Dakota prairie had been flat and open, but this was something else. Mountains jagged against the western sky. Valleys folding into valleys, and not a single human structure visible in any direction. They reached the claim on the 3rd day, having slept 2 nights in the open, having eaten the last of their bread that morning. Marta dropped the canvas sack in the meadow and stood there breathing hard, trying to make the numbers work in her head. She needed to build a cabin. The Homestead Act required a dwelling of at least 12 by 14 feet. She had never built anything larger than a chicken coop. She needed to cut firewood, 8 cords, maybe 10, for a Montana winter. A cord was a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, 8 feet long. She had never felled a tree in her life. She needed to do this alone. No husband, no father, no brothers old enough to swing an axe. Just herself and Jakob, who was too small to lift a log and too young to understand what would happen if she failed. The arithmetic was simple. A grown man with experience could cut and split a quarter cord of firewood per day. She had no experience. Call it an eighth of a cord if she was lucky. 8 cords meant 64 days of cutting, and that assumed she didn't need to build a cabin, clear a garden, haul water, cook food, or sleep. She had 14 weeks, 98 days. The numbers didn't add up. They couldn't add up. A child could see it. Jakob tugged at her sleeve. Marta, where do we sleep? She looked at the empty meadow, the timber on the slope, the creek running past. We build, she said. The man appeared on the 5th day. Marta was stripping bark from a lodgepole pine she'd spent 3 hours felling. The tree had fallen wrong, gotten hung up in the branches of its neighbor, and she'd had to cut a second tree just to bring the first one down. Her hands were already blistered, her shoulders screamed. She had produced exactly 1 log suitable for building. The rider came from the north, following the creek. He was old, 50 at least, maybe older, with a gray beard and a wide-brimmed hat weathered almost white. His horse was a sturdy bay mare. His rifle sat in a scabbard at his knee. He stopped at the edge of the meadow and watched her work for a long moment. Then he dismounted and walked toward her, moving like a man who had all the time in the world. "You the German girl?" Marta set down the draw knife. "I am Marta Stahl. Amos Keller. I've got the claim 2 miles north." He looked at the single log lying in the grass, looked at the felled trees on the slope, looked at the canvas tent she'd rigged between 2 saplings. "You planning to homestead this land?" "Yes." "Alone?" "With my brother." Keller turned and saw Jakob sitting by the creek, picking at the blisters on his own small hands. The boy had tried to help with the bark stripping. He'd lasted maybe an hour. Keller's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "How old are you?" he asked. 15. "And the boy?" 8. He was quiet for a moment. Then he walked the perimeter of the meadow. He's studying the timber, the water, the slope of the land. He moved like a man taking inventory. When he came back, he squatted on his heels and picked up a handful of soil, crumbling it between his fingers. "Good land," he said. "Good water. Your father picked well." "My father is dead." "I figured." He stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. "You know how much firewood you'll need to survive a Montana winter?" 8 cords, maybe more. More. This isn't South Dakota. Temperature drops to 30, 40 below for weeks at a time. 8 cords is the minimum for a tight cabin with a good stove. You don't have a tight cabin. You don't have a stove. You're looking at 10 cords, maybe 12. Marta said nothing. A man who knows what he's doing can cut and split a quarter cord a day. You're not a man. You don't know what you're doing. He glanced at her blistered hands. You've got 14 weeks until the first real snow. Do the arithmetic. I have done the arithmetic. Then you know you can't make it. She didn't answer. Keller sighed. It wasn't unkind. It was the sigh of a man who had seen this before. I've lived in this territory 12 years, he said. Buried 2 neighbors who froze in their cabins. Ola Henriksen found him 3 feet from his own door, stiff as a board. His wife made it to spring. Their daughter didn't. He looked at Jakob again. That boy of yours will be dead by February. You're building a coffin, not a shelter. The words hit like stones. Marta felt them land, felt the bruise spreading somewhere in her chest. I will not let him die. What you will or won't let doesn't matter. Winter doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care how much you love that boy. It doesn't care that you're 15 and alone and too stubborn to see sense. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch. I'll give you $15 for your claim, right now. That's enough for rail fare back east, plus a few meals. You can find family somewhere, an orphanage, something. No. He held the pouch out. Take it. This isn't courage, girl. This is foolishness. You'll die here, and you'll take that boy with you. No. Keller stood there for a long moment, the pouch extended. Then he put it back in his saddlebag and mounted his horse. Suit yourself, he said. I'll come check on you after the first blizzard. If you're still alive, I'll admit I was wrong. If you're not... He shook his head. Well, see, I've buried neighbors before. He rode north without looking back. Marta watched him go. Then she picked up the draw knife and went back to stripping bark. Her hands were shaking. She told herself it was exhaustion. Jakob appeared at her elbow. Marta, what did the man say? Nothing important. He looked angry. He was not angry. He was afraid. Afraid of what? She didn't answer. She couldn't tell him the truth, that Amos Keller was afraid of burying 2 more neighbors, and that his fear was probably justified. The numbers didn't work. They couldn't work. But she kept stripping bark anyway. 2 weeks later, Marta understood that Amos Keller had been generous with his estimates. Her cabin walls were 4 logs high, barely waist level. She needed at least 12 logs high for a proper roof, and she was running out of trees close enough to the building site to drag by hand. Every log now meant a longer haul. Every haul meant more hours. Every hour meant less time for firewood. And the firewood. God in heaven, the firewood. She had cut and split exactly 3/4 of a cord. It sat in a pitiful stack by the tent, not even tall enough to hide behind. She needed 10 cords. She had 3/4 of one. Her hands were no longer blistered. The blisters had hardened into calluses, and the calluses had cracked and bled, and now her palms were a mess of dried blood and dead skin. Her left shoulder ached constantly from the axe work. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. When she looked at her reflection in the creek, she saw cheekbones sharper than they had been, eyes sunk deeper in their sockets. Jakob's cough had started 3 days ago. Light at first, then deeper. He slept in the tent while she worked, and sometimes she heard him coughing even from the timberline, small and wet and wrong. She was failing. She could feel it, the slow collapse of her plan, the numbers refusing to cooperate, the calendar grinding forward regardless of what she needed. And then, on a morning when the sky was gray and the air smelled like rain, she remembered the chickens. It came back to her while she was chinking gaps in the cabin wall, stuffing mud and grass into the spaces between logs, trying to seal out the wind. The mud kept cracking as it dried. The gaps kept appearing. No matter how carefully she packed the mixture, the wind would find a way through. And she thought, this is what killed the Henriksen girl, not the cold itself. Or is the wind? The drafts that snaked through every crack and gap, stealing heat faster than any fire could replace it. A cabin was just a box, and a box was only as tight as its weakest seam. Back at Bonhomme, she had built a chicken coop with double walls. The other children had laughed at her. The elders had called it wasteful, twice the lumber for the same interior space. But Marta had noticed something the others hadn't. The chickens died in winter. Every year, 1/3 of the flock froze despite the coop's solid construction. Wind cut through the chinking, cold radiated through the logs. So she built a second wall, an outer shell, rough and ugly, surrounding the inner coop with a gap of 6 inches between them. She stuffed the gap with straw, free, abundant, available anywhere. That winter, her chickens survived. All of them. While other co-ops lost bird after bird, hers held steady. The elders noticed, grudgingly admitted the hens were healthy, and then punished her for wasting communal resources anyway. Holzverschwendung, wood waste. Now, standing in Montana territory with cracked hands and a half-built cabin and a brother whose cough grew worse each night, Marta thought about those chickens. A cabin was just a coop for people. What if she built 2 walls? The idea crystallized over the next 3 days, taking shape in her mind like a structure she could almost touch. Her cabin was 12 by 14 feet, small, tight. If she chinked it perfectly, which she couldn't, it might hold heat reasonably well, but the wind would always find a way through. That was the nature of log construction. The wood expanded and contracted with moisture. The chinking cracked. The gaps appeared. But what if the wind never reached the cabin at all? She paced out the dimensions in the meadow, using sticks to mark the corners. An outer shell, rough built, surrounding the cabin on all sides. Not another cabin. That would take months she didn't have. Just a shed. A barn. A windbreak made of walls instead of trees. The measurements, 18 by 22 feet. That would give her a gap of 2 to 3 feet on all sides between the outer shell and the inner cabin. The construction could be crude. Vertical posts sunk into the ground. Horizontal poles lashed between them. A steep roof to shed snow. She didn't need it airtight. She just needed it solid enough to stop the wind. And the gap. The gap was the key. She remembered something her father had said once, years ago, when she'd asked why the colony barns were built with double-thick walls. Dead air, he'd called it. Still air doesn't move, doesn't carry heat away, trap the air, trap the warmth. The gap would be filled with prairie grass, dried, bundled, stuffed floor to ceiling, free, abundant, light enough for her and Jakob to carry. The grass would create thousands of tiny pockets of trapped air, each one holding warmth like a wool blanket. The outer shell would block the wind. The grass would trap the heat. The inner cabin would stay warm with half the firewood. Maybe less. But the cost. God, the cost. Building the outer shell would take 3 weeks, maybe 4. That was time she didn't have. Every log she used for the shell was a log she couldn't burn. Every day she spent building was a day she couldn't cut firewood. If the design worked, she would survive the winter on 4 or 5 cords instead of 10. If it failed, she would have wasted her only chance. There was no backup plan. There couldn't be. She didn't have enough time for 2 approaches. Marta stood in the meadow, staring at the stick markers in the grass, and felt the weight of the gamble settling onto her shoulders. She was betting everything, her life, Jakob's life, on something she'd done once with chickens. The wind kicked up, cold and sharp, carrying the first hint of autumn. She made her decision. The woman came from the south, riding a mule with a travois trailing behind. Marta was cutting grass in the meadow, building bundles for the gap stuffing, when she saw the rider approaching. She straightened, one hand drifting toward the axe leaning against the cabin wall. Of course, the woman was perhaps 40 years old, maybe a few years more. Her face was weathered brown by sun and wind, her hands rough and capable looking. She rode like someone who had been in the saddle her whole life. "You're the German girl," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I am Marta Stahl. Hannah Osberg. I've got the claim 4 miles south." She dismounted, grimacing as her boots hit the ground. Some old injury in her hip, maybe. "Heard about you in Lewistown. Thought I'd see for myself." She walked past Marta without waiting for an invitation, circling the half-built cabin, the stack of cut logs, the pitiful firewood pile. When she reached the stick markers in the meadow, she stopped. What's this? An outer wall. Hannah turned to look at her. You're building two structures? Yes. Why? Marta explained. The wind, on the dead air, the chickens. She kept her voice steady, factual, as if she were describing something obvious rather than something insane. Hannah listened without interrupting. When Marta finished, the older woman was silent for a long moment. My father built houses in Norway, she said finally. Good houses, tight houses. I've never heard of anything like this. Worked for the chickens. You're not a chicken. Hannah's voice was flat. That boy is not a chicken. You're gambling his life on a farm girl's notion. The numbers do not work otherwise. Then the numbers don't work at all. Hannah walked back to her mule and untied a bundle from the travois. Salt pork wrapped in oiled cloth, a sack of dried beans, cornmeal in a paper bag. I brought these. Consider it a welcome gift. Marta didn't move to take them. I cannot pay. I didn't ask for payment. I asked for nothing. Hannah set the bundle on the ground. I watched my husband die 3 years ago. Typhoid. I've run my claim alone ever since. I know what alone means. She climbed back onto the mule, the movement stiff and painful. Build your two walls if you want. I think it's foolish, and I think you'll regret spending time on it when you should be cutting firewood. But it's your claim, your choice. She gathered the reins. I'll come check on you before the snow. If you're still alive, I'll admit I was wrong about the foolishness. And if I'm not? Hannah didn't answer. She turned the mule south and rode away, the travois bumping empty over the grass. Marta stood there, watching her go, and wondered how many people would come to check if she was still alive. And how many were already counting her among the dead. The man in the town suit arrived in mid-September, driving a buggy over the rough track from Lewistown. Marta was hauling poles for the outer shell, dragging them from the timberline one at a time, when she heard the wheels and the snort of the horse. She dropped the pole and walked to meet him, wiping her hands on her apron. He was perhaps 45, clean-shaven, wearing a suit that had no business being this far from a city. His boots were polished, his hands were soft. He smiled when he saw her, and the smile made something cold move in her stomach. Miss Stahl, I presume. Who are you? Silas Garrett. I handle land transactions out of Lewistown. He climbed down from the buggy, still smiling, and produced a surveyor's map from his coat pocket. No, I was passing through and thought I'd introduce myself. Always good to know the neighbors. He wasn't a neighbor. Marta knew it instantly, the way she'd known when Elder Wirtz was about to announce a punishment. Something in the eyes, something calculated. Garrett walked the perimeter of the claim, consulting his map, making small sounds of appreciation. Good water, he murmured. Good timber, southern exposure. Your father, rest his soul, had an eye for land. What do you want? He turned, the smile still fixed in place. Straight to business. I appreciate that. He folded the map and tucked it away. I'm prepared to offer you $30 for your claim. Right now, cash in hand, plus wagon passage to Fort Benton, where you can catch a steamer wherever you'd like to go. The claim is not for sale. I understand. It's difficult to give up on a dream. But Miss Stahl, may I call you Marta? The realities of Montana are harsh. A single woman, a child dependent, no visible means of support. He shook his head. I've seen this story before. It rarely ends well. The claim is not for sale. Garrett's smile didn't waver, but something harder appeared behind it. I bought 7 claims in the past 2 years. Widows, mostly. Families who couldn't make it work. I pay fair prices and I don't take advantage. Ask anyone in Lewistown. I'm not selling. You have spirit. I admire that. He glanced at the outer shell structure. The posts sunk into the ground, the first horizontal poles lashed into place. What exactly are you building here? A windbreak. It looks like a barn. Are you planning to raise livestock? Yes, because that's a considerable undertaking for... It is a windbreak. He studied her for a moment, still smiling, still calculating. Then he shrugged. Suit yourself. I'll be in Lewistown through the winter. If you change your mind, when you change your mind, send word. My offer stands. He climbed back into the buggy and gathered the reins. One more thing, Marta, a word of friendly advice. She waited. I've bought claims from widows before. Women who lost their husbands to accidents, disease, the cold. It's a tragedy every time. His eyes moved to Jacob, who was watching from the tent flap. I've never bought a claim from orphans. There's a first time for everything, of course, but it would be a shame. He tipped his hat and drove away. Marta stood in the meadow, fists clenched at her sides, and felt the cold rage spreading through her chest. He was a vulture, circling, waiting for her to fail. She would not give him the satisfaction. She walked back to the timberline, grabbed the pole she dropped, and started dragging it toward the building site. Her shoulders burned. Her hands bled. She didn't care. She had work to do. The days blurred together. Cut, haul, build, chink, stuff, repeat. September 15th. The outer shell walls reached full height. 8 feet of rough-built poles, lashed tight at every joint. Not pretty, not elegant, but solid. September 22nd. The roof went up. Steep pitch, like a barn designed to shed snow before the weight could collapse it. Sawed over pine boughs, over poles. Heavy, back-breaking work. Marta fell off the ladder twice. The second time, she lay in the grass for 10 minutes, staring at the sky, unable to make her legs work. Jacob found her there. Marta, are you dead? No. Are you sure? She laughed, a small crack sound, and pulled herself upright. Help me up, Bruder. We have work to finish. October 1st, the gap stuffing began. This was Jacob's task as much as hers. He couldn't lift logs, couldn't swing an axe, couldn't climb ladders. But he could cut prairie grass, he could bundle it. He could carry armloads from the meadow to the building site, stuffing them into the gap between the walls while Marta packed them tight from above. They worked from dawn until dark. They worked until their hands bled and their backs ached and their eyes burned from exhaustion. The gap was 2.5 feet wide and nearly 200 feet around the perimeter, floor to ceiling. It took 3 days to fill it all, and when they finished, the outer shell looked less like a building and more like a giant cocoon swollen with grass. October 10th. Marta counted the firewood. 4.5 cords, stacked against the outer shell wall, protected from snow and rain. It was more than she'd had 2 weeks ago, but still less than half what Keller said she needed. If she was wrong about the double wall, if the design failed, if the grass wasn't enough, if the wind found a way through anyway, 4.5 cords would last maybe 2 months. She needed 7, but there was no more time. The inner cabin was finished. The outer shell was finished. The gap was stuffed. Now there was nothing to do but cut firewood and wait. The first frost came on September 28th. The first snow flurries came on October 14th, light, melting, barely more than mist. But everyone knew what they meant. Winter was coming. The storm hit on October 19th. Not the big one, not the killing cold, just an early taste. 2 days of wind and snow, temperatures dropping to 18 degrees below zero, the kind of weather that reminded everyone what was coming. Marta huddled in the inner cabin with Jakob, feeding the stove one stick at a time, watching the fire burn. The wind screamed outside, battering against the outer shell with a sound like fists pounding on a door. But inside the cabin, something strange happened. The temperature held. She had hung a mercury thermometer, borrowed from Hannah Osberg during a visit the week before, on the inside wall. When the storm started, the cabin was 43 degrees. She expected it to drop, expected to burn through firewood fighting to maintain even that meager warmth. Instead it rose, 45, 47. By the second day, the cabin was holding at 52 degrees, and she had barely touched her firewood stack. She bundled herself in her coat and stepped into the gap space between the walls. The difference hit her immediately. Outside, the wind howled at 18 below. Inside the gap, surrounded by packed grass and sheltered from the wind, the air was cold but still. She could breathe without her lungs burning. She could stand without the wind cutting through her clothes. 23 degrees. The gap space was holding at 23 degrees, 41 degrees warmer than outside. It was working. The dead air, the grass, the double walls. It was actually working. Marta pressed her hand against the inner cabin wall and felt the faint warmth radiating through. The cabin wasn't fighting the full force of winter. It was fighting a buffer, a cushion, a shield. She went back inside and stood by the stove, trembling. Not from cold, from relief. Hannah Osberg arrived 2 days after the storm, riding through the snow on her mule. Marta met her at the outer shell door. Hannah's face was windburned, her eyebrows crusted with ice. She looked exhausted. "You're alive," Hannah said. "Yes." "The boy?" "Also alive." Hannah dismounted, groaning as her hip took her weight. She stood there for a moment, looking at the outer shell, the snow piled against its walls, the chimney smoke rising from within. "May I see inside?" Marta led her through the outer door, into the gap space, through the inner door to the cabin. Hannah moved slowly, pausing in the gap to feel the air, studying the packed grass, the construction of the walls. Inside the cabin, she stood by the stove and looked at the thermometer. 49 degrees, she said. "It dropped a little when I opened the doors." "How much firewood have you burned since the storm started?" "Perhaps a quarter cord." Hannah was quiet for a long moment. Then she walked back into the gap space and stood there, surrounded by grass and dead air and trapped warmth. "I still think it's foolish," she said finally, "but it's well-built foolishness." She turned to face Marta. "I've never seen anything like this work. I'm not saying it will keep working. January isn't October. But," she trailed off. "But?" Hannah shook her head. "You may actually survive this. I didn't think you would. I was wrong." It wasn't much, a grudging half-admission from a skeptical neighbor. But standing in the gap space, feeling the warmth that shouldn't exist, Marta felt something loosen in her chest. She might actually survive. She might actually keep her brother alive. 3 days later, Hannah returned with a travois loaded with firewood. 2 cords, cut, split, and stacked. More wood than Marta had managed to produce in 2 months of backbreaking labor. "This isn't charity," Hannah said. "I need someone to watch my cabin next month while I go to Lewistown for supplies. You watch it for 3 days, the wood is yours." They both knew it was charity. The watching would take no real effort. The trade was a fiction designed to let Marta accept without surrendering her pride. Oh, she took it anyway. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. Just stay alive." Hannah looked at the sky, gray and heavy with unfallen snow. It's going to be a bad winter. The geese went south early. The beavers are building bigger than usual. Old signs, but they've never been wrong. She climbed onto her mule. What you built here, the double wall, I still don't understand it, but if it works through January, I'm going to build one next summer. You'll show me how. I will show you. Hannah nodded once and rode away. Marta added the new firewood to her stack. 6.5 cords, still short of Keller's minimum, but if the double wall kept performing the way it had during the October storm, maybe it would be enough. Maybe. November came with teeth. The first true blizzard hit on the 22nd, over 18 inches of snow, winds howling past 40 miles per hour, temperatures dropping to 12 degrees below zero. It lasted 2 days. When it ended, the world outside was white and silent, buried under drifts that reached the eaves of ordinary cabins. Marta's outer shell was buried to the window line. Snow had piled against the walls, packed solid by the wind, creating another layer of insulation she hadn't planned for. Inside the gap space, the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees. Still 6 degrees above zero, still 40 degrees warmer than outside. Inside the cabin, she and Jakob ate soup by the stove and listened to the wind die down. They were alive. They had burned less than half a cord in 2 days. The numbers were finally starting to work. December brought Amos Keller. He arrived on snowshoes, now moving through the drifts with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 100 times. Marta met him at the outer shell door. "You're alive," he said. "Yes." "The boy?" "Alive and healthy." Keller looked at the outer shell, the snow-packed walls, the chimney smoke rising from within, the strange double structure that had confused every visitor. He didn't ask to come inside. He just stood there, studying it. "The blizzard killed 30 head on the Halverson place," he said. "Cattle froze standing up. They're still out there in the snow, too deep to move." He paused. "Old Strand's family barely made it. Burned their furniture to stay warm after the firewood ran out. And you?" "I'm fine. I've got 8 cords stacked in a cabin that's tight." He looked at her firewood pile. So the 6.5 cords stacked against the outer shell, barely touched. "How much have you burned since November?" "Less than 1 cord." His eyebrows rose. "For the whole month?" "The double wall holds the heat. I do not need to fight the wind." Keller was silent for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "That wasn't a real storm," he said. "November's just the warm-up. January's coming. You'll burn through that firewood by February, and then what?" "Then I will see." He looked at her. 15 years old, alone except for an 8-year-old brother, standing in the snow in a coat too thin for the weather, and somehow still alive. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met," he said, "or the most foolish." "Perhaps both." He almost smiled. Almost. Then he turned and snowshoed back toward his own claim, disappearing into the white. The days shortened. The cold deepened. The sky turned iron gray and stayed that way for weeks. And then, on January 1st, 1887, the temperature rose. Not much. Just enough to bring the mercury above zero. Just enough to let the snow soften and the ice crack. Old-timers in Lewistown called it the breather, a pause before the real cold, a chance to prepare for what was coming. Marta used the break to haul more deadfall from the timberline. Half a cord of branches and fallen limbs, not as good as split logs, but better than nothing. Jakob helped carry the smaller pieces, coughing less than he had in November, his cheeks pink with cold and effort. For 5 days, the weather held. 5 days of relative warmth, temperatures in the teens, skies clearing to pale blue. And then, On January 9th, the sky turned black. The cloud came from the northwest. Marta saw it from the meadow, where she was cutting the last of the salvageable deadfall. A wall of darkness rolling over the mountains, moving faster than a horse could run, swallowing the peaks and valleys as it came. She dropped the axe and ran. Jakob was inside the cabin, reading from their mother's Bible by the light of the single window. He looked up when Marta burst through the doors, outer, then inner, her face white, her breath coming in gasps. "Storm," she said. "A bad one. Get the water inside." They had practiced this. In the minutes before the wall hit, they hauled buckets from the creek, filled every container they had, checked the firewood stack, secured the outer door. The wind was already rising, already screaming through the timber on the slope, already tearing at the corners of the outer shell. Then the snow came, not falling, driving. Horizontal sheets of white that cut visibility to nothing, that piled against the outer wall faster than seemed possible, that roared and howled and screamed like something alive and angry. Marta and Jakob huddled by the stove and listened to the end of the world. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it even inside the cabin, the cold pressing against the walls, seeping through the gaps, fighting against the fire. She fed the stove more wood, then more, then more. Outside, in the gap space, she could hear the wind battering the outer shell. The poles groaned, the grass rustled and shifted. Snow was driving through the cracks in the outer wall, piling on the floor of the gap space, was slowly filling the buffer zone that was supposed to save them. The thermometer read 34 degrees, then 32, then 29. Jakob sat by the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned, his breath steaming in the cold air. "Marta, are we going to die?" She looked at him, 8 years old, thin despite her best efforts, eyes too old for his face. "No," she said, "we are not going to die." She didn't know if she was lying. By morning, the blizzard had not stopped. 16 inches of snow had fallen. More was coming. The gap space was drifted 3 feet deep, snow piled against the inner cabin wall. The outer shell had held sharp, barely, but the wind had found gaps, had driven snow through every crack. And then Jakob started coughing, not the light cough of October, a deep, wet, racking sound that shook his whole body. His forehead was hot when Marta touched it. His eyes were glassy. Fever. She looked at the blizzard raging outside, the snow piled against the doors, the miles of white hell between her and the nearest neighbor. There was no help coming. There was no medicine. There was only her and her brother and a fire that needed feeding and a storm that would not end. The temperature outside had dropped to 46 degrees below zero, and the real crisis had just begun. The fever came on fast. By midday on January 10th, Jakob could not keep water down. His skin burned under Marta's hand, hot and dry, wrong in a way that made her stomach clench. He shivered beneath the blankets, even as sweat beaded on his forehead. "Mama," he whispered, "where is Mama?" Their mother had been dead for 11 months. Jakob knew this. But the fever had taken him somewhere else, somewhere Marta could not follow. She wiped his face with a damp cloth. She fed the stove another stick. She listened to the wind scream against the outer shell and tried to think. The nearest neighbor was Amos Keller, 2 miles north. In good weather, she could walk it in 40 minutes. In this, the snow-driving horizontal, visibility measured in inches, temperature at 46 below Asta, she would be dead before she reached the timberline. People froze 3 feet from their own doors in storms like this. She had heard the stories. She believed them now. There was no help coming. There was no medicine to give. All she could do was keep him warm and pray. But keeping him warm meant burning more firewood. She had been banking the fire at night, letting the cabin cool to the low 30s while they slept, conserving wood for the long months ahead. Now she couldn't do that. Jakob needed constant warmth. His body was fighting something inside him, and the cold was an enemy it couldn't afford. She fed the stove. She watched the firewood pile shrink. Outside, the blizzard raged on. The storm lasted 3 days. Marta measured time by the firewood. By the end of the first day, she had burned nearly a quarter cord, more than she'd used in the previous 2 weeks combined. By the end of the second day, she was approaching half a cord. At this rate, she would run out by the end of January. But that calculation assumed Jakob survived. And right now, that assumption felt like a lie. His fever spiked on the night of January 10th. She pressed snow against his wrists and forehead, nor trying to cool him, and he thrashed and cried out for people who were dead. Their mother, their father, the colony children he had played with before the shunning. "Marta," he gasped, sometime in the black hours before dawn. "Marta, I'm cold." "I know, Bruder, I know." She piled every blanket they owned onto him. She lay beside him, pressing her body against his back, sharing what warmth she had. The stove crackled. The wind howled. The temperature inside the cabin hovered at 36 degrees, and she could not make it higher without burning through their reserves. She did not sleep. She listened to his breathing, ragged, wet, wrong, and she waited. On the morning of January 11th, something changed. The wind was still screaming, the snow was still falling. But when Marta pressed her hand to Jakob's forehead, she felt the heat receding, not gone, but less. She waited an hour, afraid to hope. Then another. His breathing eased. The wet rattle in his chest softened. He stopped calling for their mother and started calling for water instead. She gave him water, a little at a time. He kept it down. By midday, his eyes were clear again. He looked up at her from the blankets, pale and thin, but present. "Marta, what happened?" "You were sick. The fever's breaking." "How long?" "2 days." He was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then, "I'm hungry." She laughed. It came out cracked and strange, more sob than sound, but it was a laugh. She made him broth from the last of the salt pork, thin and weak, but warm, and he drank it without complaint. Outside, the blizzard continued. But inside the double-walled cabin, something had shifted. The worst had passed. Maybe. The storm ended on January 12th. Marta woke to silence, a silence so profound it felt like pressure against her ears. No wind, no driving snow, just the crackle of the fire and Jakob's steady breathing beside her. She rose, pulled on her coat, and opened the inner door to the gap space. Snow. Everywhere. Drifted 3 feet deep against the inner wall, piled to the ceiling in the corners, packed solid by days of wind. The gap space was half filled with white, but it had held. The outer shell had taken the brunt of the storm, the battering wind, the driving snow, the killing cold, and the inner cabin had survived behind it. The grass stuffing was wet in places where snow had melted, but the dead air principle had worked even with snow invading the buffer zone. She pushed through the snow in the gap space and forced open the outer door. The world outside was white and still. Drifts reached the eaves of trees. The meadow had become a frozen sea, waves of snow sculpted by wind into strange ridges and valleys. The sky was pale gray, flat, exhausted, and 2 miles to the north a thin line of smoke rose from Amos Keller's chimney. He was alive. They were both alive. Marta stood in the snow, breathing air so cold it burned her lungs, and felt tears freeze on her cheeks before they could fall. She did not learn what had happened to the others until later, much later. Over 100 people died in the storm of January 9th through 12th, 1887. Across Montana Territory, across Dakota, across the northern plains, they froze in their cabins and their barns and their beds. Some ran out of firewood. Some got lost in the whiteout trying to reach their stock. Some simply gave up, let their fires die, and waited for the cold to take them. The Halverson Ranch lost 340 cattle in a single night. Cowboys found the animals frozen standing up, legs locked, ice in their open eyes. The Strand family survived, but only because they burned their furniture, their floorboards, their door frames, everything that would catch fire after their woodpile ran out. A freighter named Thomas Macon was found 2 weeks after the storm, frozen solid in his wagon 3 miles outside of Lewistown. He had been carrying supplies to outlying homesteads. His horses had died in the traces. He had died trying to reach shelter on foot. Silas Garrett, the land speculator, she rode out from Lewistown on January 12th to check on his investments. He turned back after a mile. The drifts were too deep, the cold too fierce. He told the storekeeper in Lewistown that he figured the German girl and her brother were already dead. "Shame about the boy," he said. 4 days after the storm, Amos Keller appeared at the outer shell door. He was on snowshoes, moving slow, his face windburned and his beard crusted with ice. He stopped when he saw Marta in the gap space, shoveling out the drifted snow. "You're alive," he said. "Yes." "The boy?" "Alive. He was sick during the storm. Fever. He's better now." Keller stood there for a long moment, looking at the double-walled structure, the snow piled against the outer shell, the cabin chimney sending up its thin stream of smoke. Can I come inside?" Marta led him through the gap space, through the inner door, into the cabin. Jakob was sitting by the stove, wrapped in blankets, reading from their mother's Bible. He looked up when Keller entered, but did not speak. Keller walked the perimeter of the small cabin. He checked the thermometer, 44 degrees. He examined the chinking, the door seals, the stovepipe. Then he went back into the gap space and stood there, surrounded by packed grass and trapped air and warmth that should not exist. "How much firewood did you burn during the storm?" he asked. "Half a cord, perhaps a little more." "For 3 days? In 46 below?" "The double wall holds the heat. The wind never reaches the cabin." He was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, but something had shifted behind his eyes. "I've lived in this territory 12 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of ways to die and a few ways to live. I never saw anything like this." Marta waited. "I told you that boy would be dead by February." He looked at her, 15 years old, exhausted, thin, alive. "I was wrong. I'm not too proud to say it. You were being careful. You'd seen others fail." "I had. I've buried them." He shook his head. "You built something that shouldn't work. You knew it shouldn't work, and it worked anyway." "I did not know it would work, I hoped." "Hope doesn't keep people alive in Montana." "No," she said, "but sometimes it gives them a reason to try." Keller was quiet again. Then he reached out and touched the packed grass of the gap wall, feeling the insulation, the trapped air, the simple physics that had defied his experience. "I don't understand how this works," he said, "but I'd like to learn. Will you show me?" The next weeks brought visitors. Word spread through Lewistown, carried by freighters and ranchers and neighbors checking on neighbors. The German girl had survived. The German girl and her brother, alone on their claim through the worst storm in memory, and they had done it with less than 7 cords of firewood. People wanted to see. People wanted to understand. The rancher from the Halverson place came first, a weathered man in his 50s who had just finished burying 300 cattle in mass graves. He walked through the gap space without speaking, touching the walls, measuring the distances with his eyes. "How much did this cost you?" he asked. "Nothing but time. The grass is free. The poles came from the timber on my claim." "How much time?" 3 weeks for the outer shell, another week for the gap stuffing." He nodded slowly. "I lost 300 head because I didn't build windbreaks. Figured the cattle could fend for themselves, same as always." He looked at her. "Next year I'm building shelters. Not like this. Can't put a barn over a barn, but something. Walls on the north side. Packed straw. Trap the heat. It will help. It had better." He tipped his hat and left. A freighter came next, the one who ran supplies between Lewistown and the outlying claims. He made sketches on a scrap of paper while Marta explained the design, the gap width, the grass density, the importance of blocking wind rather than just trapping heat. "I'm going to tell everyone I meet," he said. This could save lives." "I hope so." 3 settlers from the Judith Basin arrived together, riding in a group for safety. They had heard the story secondhand and didn't quite believe it. Marta showed them everything: the construction, the temperatures, the firewood consumption record she had kept on a charcoal-marked board. "My wife said I was crazy for coming out here," one of them said. "She's going to say I'm crazier for building a second wall around our cabin." "Perhaps, but she will be warm." He laughed. "That's the truth." Hannah Osberg arrived in early February, riding her mule through drifts that reached the animal's belly. She did not ask for a tour. She did not ask for explanations. She simply walked through the structure, outer door, gap space, inner door, and stood in the cabin feeling the warmth, Uji watching the fire burn low and steady in the stove. "I said it was foolish," she said. "You did." "I said you were gambling with the boy's life." "You did." She turned to face Marta. Her eyes were bright, unreadable. "I was wrong, and I'm not too proud to say so." She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a notebook, actual paper, precious and expensive. "Teach me everything, the measurements, the materials, the technique. I'm building one of these come summer, and I want to do it right." Marta taught her. For 3 hours they sat by the stove while Marta drew diagrams and explained principles and answered questions. Hannah wrote everything down in her careful, cramped handwriting. When she left, she paused at the outer door. "You know what they're calling you in Lewistown?" "No." "The girl who built a coat for her house." Hannah almost smiled. "It's not an insult. It's admiration. Grudging, maybe. But real." She rode away through the snow, and Marta watched her go. By March, the worst was over. The Chinook winds came on the 14th, warm air rolling down from the mountains, melting snow, turning the frozen landscape into rivers of mud and meltwater. Cattle that had survived the winter emerged from sheltered draws, gaunt and staggering. Settlers emerged from their cabins, blinking in the light, counting their losses. Marta's firewood pile still held 2 cords. She had burned 4.5 cords through the entire winter, less than half what Keller had said she needed. The double wall had performed exactly as she hoped, blocking wind, trapping heat, turning an impossible survival equation into something merely difficult. Jacob's cough was gone. His cheeks had color again. He had grown an inch since October, despite everything, his body finding a way to thrive even in crisis. And Silas Garrett never came back. She saw him once in Lewistown in late March when she walked to town to buy seed for her spring garden. He was standing outside the land office talking to a man in a banker's suit. When he saw Marta, he stopped mid-sentence. She met his eyes. She did not speak. She did not need to. He turned away and walked in the other direction. That was victory enough. Spring came slowly to the Judith Basin. Snow lingered in the shadowed draws until May. Ice broke up on the creek in stages, great slabs calving off and floating downstream. The meadow emerged from white to brown to green, grass pushing up through the mud, wildflowers following. Marta planted her garden. Jakob helped, his small hands pressing seeds into the warming soil. They would have potatoes, beans, corn, squash. They would have food for next winter. They would have reserves. And they would have neighbors. 6 cabins in the Judith Basin area were modified that summer, outer walls added on the north and west sides, gaps stuffed with grass and straw, windbreaks turned into insulation. Most were simpler than Marta's full enclosure design, partial shells, single walls, whatever the builders could manage with the time and materials they had. But the principle spread, the dead air, the trapped warmth, the simple physics that a 15-year-old girl had learned from watching chickens. Marta showed everyone who asked. She drew the same diagrams dozens of times, explaining the gap width, the grass density, the importance of blocking wind before it could steal heat. She never charged for the instruction. She never turned anyone away. "Why?" Hannah asked her once. "You could sell this. People would pay." "My people taught me that knowledge hoarded is knowledge wasted." Marta paused, remembering the colony, the shunning, the word that had followed her across the plains. Holzverschwendung. They were wrong about many things, but not about that. Amos Keller finished his modified cabin in July. It wasn't a full double wall, he didn't have the timber for that, and his existing cabin was too large to enclose completely. But he built a wind shell on the north side, 10 feet out from the wall, and stuffed the gap with a summer's worth of dried grass. When he was done, he rode to Marta's claim and asked her to inspect it. She walked through his construction, checking the post depth, the grass density, the roof pitch. It was solid work, careful. The work of a man who had been building things for decades. "Well?" he asked. "It will help. Your firewood consumption will drop by 1/3, maybe more." He nodded, satisfied. Then he looked at her. Really looked, the way he hadn't when he'd first ridden up to her claim 14 months ago. "You were 15 years old," he said. "You had nothing. No experience. No help. No reason to think you'd survive." "I had a reason." "The boy." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been ranching and farming this territory for 12 years. I've seen good men fail and bad men prosper and everything in between. I thought I knew what it took to survive out here. And now? Now I think I was missing something." He shook his head. "Stubbornness helps. Strength helps. But what you did, building something you'd never seen, betting everything on an idea, that's different. That's something I don't have a word for." Marta thought about the chickens at Bonhomme, the double-walled coop, the elders calling it foolish, wasteful, wrong. "The word is hope," she said. "Hope with a plan behind it." Keller almost smiled. "Hope with a plan. I suppose that's as good as any." He tipped his hat and rode back to his claim. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was milder than the year before. It was still cold, still hard, still Montana, but nothing like the killing season that had come before. The Chinook winds came earlier. The deep freezes came shorter. Settlers who had survived the great die-up started to rebuild, to restock, to believe that maybe the worst was behind them. Marta and Jakob made it through with firewood to spare. By the spring of 1888, at least a dozen homesteaders in central Montana had adopted some version of the double wall design. Most called it a windshell or winter jacket. A few called it the German girl's trick. The names didn't matter. What mattered was that it worked. The freighter who had made sketches spread the word along his route. A rancher's wife wrote to her sister in Minnesota describing the technique. A land office clerk in Lewistown started including a rough diagram with homestead filings, Xerox, noting that some settlers have found success with windbreak construction. The idea traveled the way all good ideas travel, hand to hand, mouth to mouth, diagram to diagram. It wasn't a revolution. It was just a tool. One more technique in the endless improvisation of frontier survival. But it was Marta's tool, her contribution, the thing she had built when everyone said she would fail. Marta Stahl proved up her homestead in 1891, receiving full title to her 160 acres. She was 20 years old. She had lived on the claim for 5 years, alone except for her brother, surviving winters that killed grown men with more resources and more experience. She never married. Neighbors asked sometimes. Suitors appeared occasionally. She turned them all away with quiet firmness, offering no explanation. Who said the claim was hers? The life she had built was hers. She did not need to share it with anyone except Jakob. Jakob grew strong. He worked the claim alongside her through his teenage years, learning to fell trees and split wood and build walls that kept out the wind. When he came of age, he filed his own homestead on adjacent land, 160 acres that shared a fence line with his sister's property. They lived side by side for decades. 2 claims, 2 cabins, 2 double-walled structures standing in the Judith Basin, while the territory became a state and the frontier became something else. Marta died in 1934 at 63 years old. A neighbor found her sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the meadow where she had first arrived with nothing but a canvas sack and $11. The doctor said her heart had simply stopped. Jakob buried her on the claim next to the creek, under a marker he carved himself. Marta Stahl. 1871 to 1934. She built what could not be built. The double-walled cabin stood until 1952, when a wildfire swept through the Judith Basin and burned the timber on the north slope. The outer shell caught first, then the inner cabin, then the grass-stuffed gap that had held warmth through 45 Montana winters. By morning, there was nothing left but ash and the stone foundation. On the 9th of January, 1887, 16 inches of snow fell in 16 hours while the temperature dropped to 46 degrees below zero. Amos Keller, who had survived 12 Montana winters and buried 2 neighbors who froze in their cabins, had looked at a 15-year-old girl and told her plainly, "That boy of yours will be dead by February. You're building a coffin, not a shelter." He was wrong. Inside a cabin wrapped in a second shell of rough-cut poles and prairie grass, Marta Stahl fed her fire, watched her brother's fever break, and waited for the blizzard to pass. The wind screamed against the outer wall, driving snow through every crack, piling drifts to the ceiling of the gap space. The temperature outside dropped to 46 below. People froze 3 feet from their own doors. Cattle died standing up. The world became white and still and deadly. And in the gap between the walls she had built, the walls her people had called wasteful, the walls her neighbors had called foolish, the walls that a child who didn't know better had constructed from hope and memory and desperation. The dead air held steady, 30 degrees warmer than the killing cold outside, warm enough to live. She was 15 years old. She had $9 and an 8-year-old brother and an idea that shouldn't have worked. It worked anyway.